The old brass bell above Romano's cafe chimed its weary protest, as Nora Blackwood flipped the sign from open to closed, though in truth, the 24-hour establishment never really closed. At 2:47 a.m., she was the sole guardian of this sanctuary. For insomniacs, night shift workers, and the occasionally desperate student, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like trapped insects, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made her reflection in the window look ghostly. She'd been working the graveyard shift for 8 months now, ever since moving into the cramped studio apartment above the antique shop next door. The pay was decent enough to cover rent in the city's oldest district, where buildings leaned against each other like weary friends, and the streets held secrets from centuries past. Most nights passed in comfortable solitude, broken only by the occasional taxi driver needing coffee or the rare insomniac seeking refuge from their thoughts. But for the past 3 weeks, her routine had been disrupted by him. Kieran Ashford lived in the Gothic Revival building across the narrow street, in what appeared to be the penthouse suite. She'd noticed him first through the cafe's front window, a tall figure silhouetted against his apartment's warm lighting, always standing perfectly still, always watching. At first, she'd assumed he was simply another neighbor with insomnia, perhaps finding comfort in the cafe's gentle glow during the dark hours. But his presence had become a constant, appearing every night at exactly midnight and remaining until dawn broke over the city's jagged skyline. Tonight felt different. The October air carried an electric tension that made her skin prickle, and the cafe's ancient espresso machine, Romano's pride and joy from 1952, had been making ominous grinding sounds all evening. As if summoned by her thoughts, the machine chose that moment to emit a death rattle and fall silent, its pilot light flickering once before dying completely. "Perfect," Nora muttered, grabbing her toolbox from beneath the counter. She'd become unexpectedly handy during her months here, learning to coax life from temperamental equipment through a combination of gentle persuasion and strategic percussion. The machine's brass casing was hot to the touch, and she could smell the acrid scent of burning wires. She was elbow-deep in its mechanical innards when the bell chimed again, announcing a visitor she hadn't heard approach. "We're technically closed," she called out without looking up, "but I can make you something if you don't mind waiting while I perform emergency surgery on this ancient beast. Perhaps I could assist." The voice was rich and cultured, with an accent she couldn't quite place, something European, but aged like wine that had been cellared for decades. She turned to find herself face to face with her mysterious neighbor for the first time. Kieran Ashford was even more striking up close than he'd appeared from a distance, tall and lean, with dark hair that seemed to absorb the fluorescent light rather than reflect it, and pale skin that suggested he rarely saw sunlight. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a deep amber color that seemed to hold flecks of gold, ancient and knowing in a way that made her suddenly aware of how young her 26 years felt. "You're the Watcher," she said, then immediately felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I mean, you live across the street. I've seen you in your window." A smile played at the corners of his mouth, revealing teeth that were perhaps a shade too sharp to be entirely normal. "Guilty as charged. And you're the guardian of this sanctuary for the sleepless." There was something about the way he moved that reminded her of a predator, not threatening, exactly, but controlled, purposeful, as if every gesture was calculated. He approached the espresso machine with the confidence of someone who had encountered similar challenges before. "May I?" he asked, indicating the open panel where she'd been working. "Be my guest. I'm Nora, by the way." Kieran, his fingers brushed hers as he took the wrench from her hand, and the contact sent an unexpected jolt through her nervous system. His skin was cool, almost cold, but the touch seemed to awaken something in her blood that made her pulse quicken. "The problem appears to be in the heating elements connection. Third wire from the left, it's corroded." She watched as he worked with movements that spoke of long familiarity with mechanical things, though his hands looked more suited to piano keys than repair work. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it felt charged with possibility, like the moment before lightning strikes. "There," he said finally, closing the panel. "Try it now." She pressed the power button, and the machine hummed to life with a contented purr. its pilot light glowing steady and blue. "How did you?" "I've had experience with temperamental machinery." He was closer now, close enough that she could smell. Something like cedar and winter air clinging to his clothes, though the night was warm for October. "Your pulse," he said suddenly, his amber eyes focusing on her throat with an intensity that made her breath catch its. "Unusual." "Unusual how?" The question came out rougher than intended, though she couldn't explain why her body was responding to his proximity with such visceral awareness. "Strong," he murmured, reaching out as if to touch the pulse point at her neck, then stopping just short of contact. "Steady," with undertones that suggest. He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "Exceptional vitality." The space between his fingertips and her skin seemed to thrum with energy, creating sensations that had nothing to do with physical touch. Her heart rate increased, her breathing deepened, and she found herself leaning slightly toward him as if drawn by some invisible force. "I should go," he said abruptly, pulling his hand back, but his eyes remained fixed on her throat, watching the rhythm visible beneath her skin with the focused attention of someone studying something precious and rare. "Wait," she said, surprising herself with the urgency in her voice. "Would you like some coffee? I mean, since you helped fix the machine, it's the least I can do for a moment." She thought he might refuse. Something flickered across his features, hunger, longing, and what looked like fear all mixed together. Then he nodded slowly, settling onto one of the vintage bar stools at the counter. As she prepared his coffee, she became acutely aware of his attention, the way his gaze followed her movements with predatory focus. When she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed again, and this time the contact lasted longer, sending warmth shooting up her arm despite the coolness of his skin. "Your life force," he said quietly, his voice rough with something that might have been desire or desperation. "It calls to me in ways I don't entirely understand." The words should have frightened her. Any rational person would have backed away, made excuses, put distance between themselves and someone who spoke about life force, as if it were something tangible, something that could be sensed or consumed. Instead, she found herself stepping closer, drawn by the vulnerability she glimpsed beneath his controlled exterior. "What are you?" she whispered. His amber eyes met hers, and in their depths she saw centuries of loneliness, hunger, and the weight of secrets that had been carried too long in silence. "Something that should probably stay away from you," he replied, but finds himself unable to. The admission hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, while the city slept around them and the ancient cafe held its breath, as if sensing that some moments have the power to change everything that comes after. The following night, Nora found herself glancing at the clock every few minutes as midnight approached. She'd spent the day thinking about Kieran, his cold touch, the way he'd spoken about her life force, and the centuries of loneliness she'd glimpsed in his amber eyes when the cafe's door chimed at exactly 12 a.m. Her pulse quickened with anticipation. "Good evening, Nora," Kieran said, settling into what had apparently become his usual seat at the counter. Tonight he wore a dark wool coat that emphasized his pale complexion, and she noticed he moved with the fluid grace of someone who had long ago stopped worrying about making noise. "The usual?" she asked, though she'd already begun preparing his coffee. Black, no sugar, served in the cafe's oldest cup, a delicate porcelain piece that Romano had claimed came from Prague. "Please." He watched her work with that same intense focus, and she could feel his attention like a physical weight. "I owe you an explanation about last night." "You don't owe me anything," she replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she set the cup before him. "But I wouldn't say no to some answers." Kieran wrapped his fingers around the cup without drinking, as if seeking its warmth. "What do you know about the history of this district?" The question wasn't what she'd expected. "It's old. Some of the buildings date back to the 1800s. There are stories about it being unusual." Unusual is a diplomatic way of putting it. His mouth curved in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This area has always attracted those who exist on the margins of what most people consider normal. The building you live above, it was once a boarding house for traveling performers, circus acts, stage magicians, individuals whose talents defied easy explanation, as if summoned by his words. Nora heard the distinctive tap-tap-tap of Mrs. Holloway's walking stick on the stairs outside. The elderly woman who owned the antique shop below Nora's apartment appeared in the cafe's doorway, her silver hair pinned in its usual neat bun, her sharp blue eyes taking in the scene with obvious interest. "Evening, dear," Mrs. Holloway said to Nora, then turned to Kieran with a nod that held surprising familiarity. "Mr. Ashford, I wondered when you'd finally introduce yourself properly." "Mrs. Holloway," Kieran replied with old-fashioned courtesy, rising from his seat. "I hope my presence hasn't been too disruptive to the neighborhood's peace." The old woman laughed, a sound like silver bells. "Peace in this district? That ship sailed sometime around 1847. She accepted the cup of tea Nora prepared without being asked, settling onto a stool with surprising agility for someone who appeared to be in her 80s. "I suppose you're wondering about our young barista's unique qualities. You know about—" Nora began, but Mrs. Holloway waved a dismissive hand. "Child, I've been managing supernatural tenants for over 60 years. Your life force practically glows. It's why I was so eager to rent you the apartment. Natural batteries are excellent for keeping the more troublesome residents calm." The casual way she spoke about supernatural tenants and life force made Nora's head spin. "I'm sorry, what? Oh dear," Mrs. Holloway said, patting Nora's hand with fingers that felt surprisingly warm. "You really didn't know, did you? You're what we call a wellspring, someone whose life energy regenerates faster than it can be depleted. It's quite rare, maybe 1 in 10,000 humans." Kieran's grip tightened on his coffee cup. "Which explains why her essence calls so strongly to beings like myself." "Beings like yourself," Nora repeated slowly. "What exactly are you, Kieran?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying the dark liquid in his cup as if it held answers. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "I'm what you might call an energy vampire, though that term carries connotations that don't quite fit. I don't drain life to cause harm, I need it to survive. Emotional energy, life force, the spark that animates conscious beings. Most humans can spare small amounts without noticing, but it requires intimate contact." "How intimate?" The question escaped before Nora could stop it, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Physical touch, the sharing of breath, connection, through pulse points where life flows closest to the surface." His amber eyes met hers, and she saw hunger there, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. "For 3 centuries, I've sustained myself on brief encounters, stolen moments, connections that lasted only long enough to provide what I needed to continue existing." Mrs. Holloway stirred her tea thoughtfully. "But wellsprings like our Nora here change the equation entirely. They can share energy without being depleted, create sustainable connections rather than parasitic ones, which is why I should stay away." Kieran said firmly, though he made no move to leave. "The hunger I feel around you is unlike anything I've experienced. It would be too easy to take more than you could safely give." Nora found herself studying his face, noting the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the way his skin seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, the careful control he maintained over every movement. "What happens if you don't feed?" "Gradual weakening, loss of cognitive function. Eventually, a kind of hibernation that can last decades." He set down his cup with precise care. "I've never let it progress that far." "And what happens if you feed too much from someone?" The silence that followed her question was answer enough. Mrs. Holloway reached over to squeeze Nora's hand gently. "The right partnership can be beautiful, dear," the old woman said softly. "I've seen it work, but it requires trust, communication, and absolute honesty about needs and boundaries." Kieran stood abruptly, his controlled facade cracking slightly. "This is exactly why I shouldn't be here. You're speaking about this as if it's a viable option, when the truth is that I've spent 3 centuries learning to take only what I need, without forming attachments. The hunger I feel around Nora threatens that control." "Maybe," Nora said quietly, "control isn't what you need." He turned to look at her, and she saw something vulnerable flicker across his features. "You don't understand what you're suggesting. Then explain it to me." She stood as well, moving closer despite every rational instinct telling her to maintain distance. "Tell me what it would mean." "It would mean connection deeper than anything you've experienced. he said, his voice rough with barely contained longing, sharing not just energy but emotions, sensations, even memories through the link. It would mean enhancement of your natural abilities, stronger intuition, increased empathy, longevity that could span centuries, and the cost, dependence. Once the bond is established, separation becomes difficult, then impossible. You would be tied to me as surely as I would be tied to you. Mrs. Holloway cleared her throat gently. Perhaps you should show her what a simple feeding feels like before discussing permanent bonds. Kieran's eyes flashed with something between hunger and fear. That's not a good idea, I think, Nora said, reaching out to touch his arm. That should be my decision. The contact sent electricity through both of them. Kieran's carefully maintained composure wavered, and she could see the war between his hunger and his protective instincts playing out across his features. Just a taste, she whispered. Show me what it feels like. His hand covered hers, cool fingers tracing the pulse point at her wrist. Your heartbeat, he murmured, his voice taking on that hypnotic quality she'd noticed the night before. It's like music, complex rhythms that speak of passion, creativity, endless vitality. The touch of his fingers against her pulse sent warmth cascading through her nervous system. She could feel her life force responding to his presence, reaching toward him like flowers turning toward sunlight. When he leaned closer, his breath cool against her throat, every nerve ending in her body came alive with anticipation. May I? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, his lips found the pulse point at her neck, and the sensation was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Not pain, but indrawing sensation that pulled something essential from deep within her and shared it with him. She could feel his hunger, his gratitude, his centuries of careful loneliness, while her own emotions flowed back to him: wonder, desire, and a sense of completion she hadn't known she was missing. The connection lasted only moments, but when he pulled away, both of them were breathing hard. His skin had more color, his eyes brighter, while she felt energized rather than drained, as if the sharing had awakened something vital within her. My dear, Mrs. Holloway said softly, I think you'd have a great deal to discuss. As Kieran's amber eyes met hers, Nora realized that whatever was happening between them had moved far beyond simple attraction. The brief taste of connection had shown her possibilities she'd never imagined, while awakening a hunger in him that 3 centuries of careful control might not be enough to contain. 3 days passed before Kieran returned to the cafe, and Nora spent every one of them replaying the moment he'd fed from her pulse point. The memory had taken on an almost dreamlike quality, but the lingering effects were undeniably real. Her senses seemed sharper, colors more vivid, and she found herself aware of people's emotional states in ways that felt entirely new. When stressed customers entered the cafe, she could almost see their tension like a gray aura, while happy patrons brought warmth that made her skin tingle. She was restocking the pastry case when the door chimed at 11:43 p.m., 17 minutes earlier than Kieran's usual rival. But the man who entered wasn't him. The stranger was tall and elegant, with silver-streaked dark hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the cafe in seconds. He wore an expensive black coat and moved with the same predatory grace she'd noticed in Kieran, but where Kieran's presence felt controlled. This man radiated barely contained power. You must be the famous Nora, he said, his voice carrying a slight accent, French, perhaps, or maybe older than that. I'm Vincent Cross. I believe we need to talk. Something about his tone made her skin crawl. The cafe is closed to new customers after midnight. Oh, I'm not here for coffee. Vincent settled onto a stool with casual confidence, his pale eyes never leaving her face. I'm here about Kieran Ashford and the rather dangerous game he's playing with your life. I don't know what you're talking about. Vincent laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Please. I can smell his essence on you, taste the residue of his feeding. Do you have any idea what you've allowed into your life? Before Nora could respond, the door chimed again, and Kieran entered with urgency that suggested he'd sense Vincent's presence. His amber eyes immediately found Vincent, and the temperature in the cafe seemed to drop several degrees. Vincent, Kieran said, his voice deadly quiet. You're not welcome here. On the contrary, old friend. I think I'm exactly where I need to be. Vincent's smile revealed teeth that were definitely too sharp for human genetics. Protecting this lovely young woman from your particular brand of destruction. You know him? Nora asked, though the tension between the two men made the connection obvious. We have history. Kieran replied, moving to place himself between Nora and Vincent. Ancient history that has nothing to do with you, doesn't it? Vincent leaned forward, his pale eyes fixed on Nora. Tell me, dear, has he mentioned Diana, or Marcus, or any of the others who thought they could safely feed his hunger? The names hit Kieran like physical blows. His controlled facade cracked, revealing pain that looked centuries deep. That's enough, is it? Because I see the same pattern emerging. The careful approach, the gentle feeding, the promises of connection and enhancement. Vincent's voice turned silky with malice. Right up until the hunger overwhelms his precious control and leaves another corpse in his wake. Stop, Kieran said, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. Vincent stood, circling them both like a shark scenting blood. Diana lasted 6 months. She thought she was special too, thought her abundant life force made her safe. We found her drained to a husk, Kieran kneeling beside her body in catatonic grief. You're lying, Nora said, but doubt crept into her voice as she watched Kieran's face. Am I? Look at him, dear. See how he can't meet your eyes. The guilt he carries is a beautiful thing, so pure, so self-destructive. Vincent paused directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell something like ozone and old blood. But guilt doesn't resurrect the dead. Kieran finally spoke, his voice hollow with remembered pain. Diana was different. She was reckless. She pushed for deeper connection than was safe, insisted on bonding despite my warnings. And when the bond was complete, Vincent prompted. I lost control. The admission seemed torn from Kieran's throat. The hunger was unlike anything I'd experienced. By the time I regained awareness, she was dead. Vincent finished with satisfaction. Completely drained. Just as Marcus was, and Isabella before him. You're a predator, Kieran. No matter how you dress it up in romantic language, Nora felt the world tilting around her. The warmth she'd experienced during their connection suddenly felt dangerous, predatory. Is it true? Kieran's amber eyes finally met hers, and she saw centuries of guilt and self-loathing reflected there. Yes, but Nora, you're different. Your regenerative abilities, your natural reserves, that's what you told Diana too, Vincent interrupted. Right before you killed her. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Nora backed away from both men, her enhanced senses suddenly overwhelming her with input. She could taste their supernatural power, smell the hunger that radiated from them both, feel the weight of their inhuman years pressing against her consciousness. I need air, she managed, heading for the cafe's back door. Nora, wait, Kieran started after her, but Vincent blocked his path. Let her go, Vincent said. Let her run while she still can. This isn't about protecting her, Kieran snarled, his control finally snapping. This is about you wanting what I found. Vincent's smile turned predatory. Can you blame me, a wellspring this powerful? The things I could accomplish with that kind of sustainable energy source. She's not an energy source. She's what? The love of your cursed life. Please, you're a parasite. Kieran, we both are. The only difference is that I'm honest about it. Outside in the alley behind the cafe, Nora pressed her back against the brick wall and tried to process what she'd just learned. The night air felt cold against her skin, but she could still feel the residual warmth from Kieran's feeding. The way her life force had reached toward him like it recognized something essential. Had Diana felt this same pull? Had she ignored the warnings because the connection felt so right, so natural? She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice Vincent's approach. Until he was standing directly in front of her. Having moved with inhuman silence, frightened, he asked, his pale eyes reflecting the alley's dim lighting like a cat's. Shouldn't I be? Absolutely. But perhaps not of the right person. He moved closer, and she caught that scent of ozone and old blood again. Kieran sees you as redemption, a chance to prove he can form connections without destroying them. But I see you as opportunity. What kind of opportunity? Vincent's smile was all teeth and hunger. The kind where I take what he's too guilty to claim properly. Your life force calls to me too. Dear Nora, And unlike Kieran, I have no qualms about taking what I need. Before she could react, his hand shot out to grasp her wrist, his fingers, finding her pulse point with practiced precision. The sensation was similar to what she'd experienced with Kieran, but wrong, somehow taking rather than sharing, draining rather than exchanging. "Stop," she gasped, but her strength seemed to be flowing out of her, leaving her weak and dizzy. "Vincent, release her." Kieran's voice cut through the night like a blade. He stood at the alley's entrance, and power radiated from him in waves that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "Make me," Vincent replied, his grip tightening on Nora's wrist. What happened next moved too fast for human eyes to follow. Kieran crossed the distance between them in a blur of motion, his hand closing around Vincent's throat with enough force to lift the other man off his feet. Vincent released Nora's wrist, clawing at Kieran's grip as he was slammed against the alley wall. "You forget," Kieran snarled, his amber eyes blazing with inhuman light, "that I'm older than you, stronger, and I have far more reason to want you gone." Vincent managed a choked laugh. "Kill me then, but ask yourself if you're willing to kill to protect her. What makes you think you won't eventually kill her to feed from her?" The question hit its mark. Kieran's grip loosened slightly, doubt flickering across his features. "That's the difference between us," Vincent continued, his voice rough from Kieran's grip. "I know what I am. You're still pretending to be something else." Kieran released him abruptly, stepping back with visible effort. Vincent straightened his coat with deliberate calm, his pale eyes moving between them. "This isn't over," he said finally. "Wellsprings like her are too rare to waste on your guilt-ridden romanticism." He turned to Nora, who was still slumped against the wall, struggling to recover from his forced feeding. "When you tire of being his redemption project, dear, you know how to find me." Then he was gone, vanishing into the shadows with inhuman speed. Kieran knelt beside Nora, his hands hovering over her without quite touching, as if afraid his presence might cause more harm. "Are you hurt?" "I don't know," she admitted, trying to assess the damage Vincent had done. She felt drained but not devastated, as if her natural regeneration was already working to restore what had been taken. "Is it true about Diana and the others?" His silence was answer enough. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I hoped." He trailed off, then started again. "Because with you, everything feels different. Your life force doesn't just call to me, it sings. And when we connected, I felt something I haven't experienced in centuries." "What?" "Hope," he said simply. "Hope that maybe Vincent is wrong, that maybe I can be more than just a predator who destroys everything he touches." Looking into his amber eyes, Nora saw the war raging within him, hunger and guilt, hope and fear, the desperate desire for connection, battling against centuries of careful isolation. The smart thing would be to walk away, to listen to Vincent's warnings and protect herself from becoming another tragic story in Kieran's long existence. But her enhanced senses were telling her something different. Where Vincent's touch had felt like theft, Kieran's presence felt like recognition, and the brief taste of connection they'd shared had awakened something in her that felt too important to abandon out of fear. "I need time to think," she said finally. Kieran nodded, though she could see the pain her words caused. "Of course, but Nora, be careful. Vincent won't give up easily. And he's right about one thing. I am dangerous. The hunger I feel around you is stronger than anything I've experienced before." As he helped her to her feet, his touch careful and controlled, Nora found herself wondering if the greatest danger lay in trusting him, or in walking away from the connection that felt like the missing piece of herself she'd never known she was searching for. The choice she made would determine not just her fate, but whether centuries of guilt and isolation could be transformed into something beautiful, or whether some hungers were simply too dangerous to feed. The blood moon rose like a crimson eye over the city, casting everything in shades of deep red that made familiar streets look alien and threatening. Nora had spent the past week researching everything she could find about energy vampires, wellsprings, and supernatural bonds, but the academic texts felt inadequate when faced with the reality of her situation. She was closing the cafe early. Something about the moon's influence had kept customers away, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the growing awareness that tonight would bring a decision she could no longer postpone. The enhanced senses she'd gained from Kieran's feeding had been growing stronger, and she could feel something building in the supernatural community around her. Luna Martinez arrived at exactly 9 p.m., her arms full of old books and her dark eyes bright with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found the missing piece of a puzzle. Nora's best friend since college was a researcher by nature, working as a folklore librarian at the university, and she'd thrown herself into investigating Nora's situation. With scholarly determination. "You're not going to believe what I found," Luna said, settling her books on the counter with careful reverence. "These texts are from private collections, grimoires, journals, first-hand accounts of supernatural bonds dating back centuries." And Nora asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer, "Vincent was lying." "Well, partially." Luna opened one of the older books, its pages yellowed with age. "There were deaths, yes, but not because the vampires were inherently predatory. Look at this, Diana Worthington's journal, written in 1847. Nora leaned over the faded script, trying to make sense of the archaic handwriting. Luna translated, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reading a tragic tale. "She writes about meeting Kieran, about the connection they shared, but also about her own reckless hunger for deeper experience. She pushed for the full bonding ritual despite his warnings, convinced her wellspring abilities made her invulnerable." Luna looked up, her expression grave. The final entry mentions Vincent's influence, how he convinced her that Kieran was holding back out of selfishness rather than caution. "Vincent manipulated her, manipulated them both. Look at this passage. Vincent says true love requires total surrender. That Kay's careful restraint proves he doesn't trust our connection. Tonight I will show him how wrong he is. Tonight we complete the bond. Consequences be damned." A chill ran down Nora's spine, and she died because of it. She died because she forced a bond before either of them was ready, during a blood moon, when supernatural energies run wild and control becomes nearly impossible. Luna flipped to another section. "But look at this, Marcus's story is different. He was bonded successfully to another vampire named Elena for over 60 years. Their relationship only ended when she was killed protecting their territory from rival supernatural factions. The revelation shifted everything Nora thought she understood about the situation. So the deaths weren't inevitable. They were tragedies caused by poor timing, manipulation, and inexperience, not inherent flaws in the bonding process itself." Luna's expression grew worried. "But Nora, there's something else. The blood moon amplifies supernatural abilities and weakens the barriers between desire and action. If Kieran's been fighting his hunger for you, tonight will test that control to its limits." As if summoned by her words, the cafe's lights flickered, and both women felt a presence approaching power that made the air itself seem to thicken with anticipation. Kieran entered through the front door, but the man who walked into the cafe was barely recognizable as the controlled individual Nora had come to know. His amber eyes blazed with inner fire, his pale skin seemed to glow with absorbed moonlight, and power radiated from him in waves that made every supernatural sensitive nerve in her body come alive. "Nora," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that resonated in her chest cavity. "You need to leave. Now, what's wrong?" "The blood moon," he managed, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides as if fighting for control. "It's amplifying everything. The hunger, the need, the connection I feel to you. I can hear your heartbeat from across the room, smell the life force flowing through your veins, feel the way your essence calls to mine." Luna gathered her books, recognizing supernatural crisis when she saw it. "I'll give you to privacy," she said, heading for the door. "But Nora, remember what I told you about timing and choice." As the door closed behind her friend, Nora found herself alone with a being whose careful humanity was being stripped away by cosmic forces beyond either of their control. "I should go," Kieran said, but he made no move toward the door. "Before I do something we'll both regret." What if we wouldn't regret it? The question escaped before Nora could stop it, carrying weeks of confusion, desire, and growing certainty about what she wanted. His amber eyes snapped to hers, and she saw hunger there so intense it made her breath catch. "You don't know what you're saying, don't I?" She moved closer, watching the way his pupils dilated as she approached. "Luna showed me the truth about Diana, about Marcus, about what really happened to your previous partners. Vincent has been manipulating us both. Vincent, Kieran's voice turned dangerous. What did he tell you? Nothing directly. But Luna found records Diana's journal, Marcus's letters. Vincent pushed Diana into premature bonding, convinced her. You were holding back out of selfishness rather than caution. Understanding dawned in Kieran's eyes, followed immediately by guilt so intense it was almost palpable. I should have realized. Vincent has always been skilled at manipulation, at turning others' desires against them. The question is, Nora said, close enough now to feel the supernatural heat radiating from his skin. What do we want to happen tonight? Not what Vincent wants, not what fear dictates, but what we choose. Kieran's control wavered visibly. What I want is irrelevant. The blood moon makes everything more intense, more dangerous. If we attempt bonding tonight, we might succeed, she finished. Or we might wait for the perfect moment. That never comes while Vincent plots to take what he wants by force. As if her words had summoned him, the cafe's back door exploded inward, and Vincent entered with two others, pale, hungry-looking beings whose eyes gleamed with predatory anticipation. How touching, Vincent said, surveying the scene with satisfaction. A blood moon reunion. Perfect timing for what I have planned. Kieran moved to place himself between Nora and the intruders, power crackling around him like barely contained lightning. Leave. Now. I don't think so, Vincent replied, nodding to his companions. You see, I've grown tired of waiting for you to self-destruct. The wellspring's power is too valuable to waste on your romantic delusions. The two vampires flanking Vincent spread out, moving with coordinated precision that spoke of long practice. Kieran's amber eyes tracked their movement while never losing awareness of Vincent's position. If you hurt her, oh, I won't hurt her, Vincent said with a smile that was all teeth and malice. I'll simply take what you're too weak to claim. A wellspring properly bonded to someone with my experience could power supernatural abilities. Beyond imagining. Nora, run, Kieran commanded, his voice carrying compulsion that made her take an involuntary step toward the door. But running felt wrong, like abandoning the one person who'd awakened something essential in her nature. Instead, she found herself moving closer to Kieran, drawn by instincts that felt older than rational thought. I'm not leaving you, she said, placing her hand on his arm. The contact sent electricity through both of them, amplified by the blood moon, until it felt like touching a live wire. Kieran's control, already stretched to its limits, finally snapped. He spun to face her, his eyes blazing with hunger and desperate need. Your pulse, he whispered, his voice rough with centuries of carefully contained desire. It's perfect, strong enough to sustain us both, complex enough to create connection deeper than anything I've dared imagine. Then take it, she said, offering her throat with trust that transcended fear. Complete the bond. Show Vincent what real partnership looks like. Kieran's hands framed her face with trembling restraint. If I start, I might not be able to stop. The blood moon will give us power enough to forge something beautiful instead of destructive. She could feel Vincent and his companions closing in, but all her attention focused on the being before her whose loneliness matched her own hidden emptiness. Trust me. Trust us. When Kieran's lips found the pulse point at her throat, the sensation was nothing like their previous gentle connection. Power flowed between them in torrents, enhanced by lunar forces, until she could feel his centuries of careful isolation being burned away by her abundant life force, while his supernatural nature awakened abilities in her that felt like coming home to herself. The bond that formed between them was immediate, an overwhelming consciousness expanding to include each other's thoughts, emotions, memories, and desires. She experienced his guilt over past failures while he felt her certainty that this was different, that her wellspring nature was meant for exactly this kind of connection. Vincent's snarl of rage barely registered through the intensity of their joining when he lunged forward, intending to interrupt the bonding process. He met not a weakened victim, but a newly enhanced being whose power had been amplified by supernatural partnership. Nora's hand shot out to catch Vincent's wrist with strength that surprised them both. The wellspring energy flowing through her now carried Kieran's centuries of accumulated power, while his abilities were sustained by her inexhaustible life force. Impossible, Vincent breathed, staring at her eyes, which now held flecks of the same amber fire that burned in Kieran's. Not impossible, Kieran said, his voice carrying new harmonics that resonated with Nora's enhanced hearing. Just unprecedented. A bonding between equals rather than predator and prey. The two vampires Vincent had brought with him took one look at the power radiating from the newly bonded pair and disappeared into the night. With supernatural speed, Vincent himself backed toward the door, his pale eyes wide with something between fear and fascination. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked his usual confidence. "Yes," Nora replied, surprised by the certainty in her voice. "It is." As Vincent vanished into the crimson night, Nora and Kieran stood in the ruins of the cafe, power still crackling between them like visible lightning. The bond had transformed them both. She was no longer entirely human, while he was no longer entirely monster. The blood moon smiled down on them through the cafe's windows, its work complete. 6 months after the blood moon bonding, Nora woke to sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the renovated apartment she now shared with Kieran in the building across from Romano's cafe. Her enhanced senses immediately cataloged the morning's details: the scent of coffee from the shop below, the sound of Luna's laughter as she chatted with Mrs. Holloway in the courtyard, and most importantly, the steady rhythm of Kieran's breathing beside her. The bonding had changed everything and nothing. She was still herself, but expanded her wellspring abilities, now consciously controlled rather than simply instinctive. Her lifespan measured in centuries rather than decades. Her awareness of the supernatural world around them sharp and clear. Kieran remained the careful, thoughtful being she'd fallen in love with, but freed from the crushing weight of guilt and isolation that had defined his existence. For so long, their connection allowed them to share energy as easily as breathing, her abundant life force sustaining his supernatural nature while his enhanced abilities protected and amplified her natural gifts. It was symbiosis in its purest form, to beings becoming something greater than the sum of their parts. "Good morning," Kieran murmured against her throat, his voice carrying the contentment of someone who'd found peace after centuries of searching. "Morning," she replied, turning in his arms to study his face in the golden light. The sharp angles remained, but the underlying tension that had once marked his features was gone, replaced by the relaxed expression of someone who no longer had to fight his own nature. A soft knock at the door interrupted their quiet moment. Luna's voice called through the wood with characteristic enthusiasm. "I know you can hear me with those supernatural senses. We have visitors." Nora and Kieran exchanged glances. In the months since their bonding, word had spread through the supernatural community about their successful partnership. They'd become inadvertent counselors, helping other energy vampires and potential wellsprings navigate the complexities of forming safe, sustainable bonds. They dressed quickly and found Luna in their living room with a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25. Her nervous energy immediately recognizable to Nora's enhanced empathy. "This is Ren," Luna said, settling back into the chair she'd claimed as her own during her frequent visits. "She's been having some unusual experiences lately." Ren looked up as they entered, and Nora immediately recognized the signs: the slight glow that wellsprings carried, the way her life force seemed to reach out towards supernatural presences, the confusion of someone discovering abilities they didn't understand. "I keep attracting strange people," Ren said without preamble, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting inexplicable circumstances. "They follow me, watch me, and when they get close, I feel this pulling sensation, like something inside me wants to connect with them." "Energy vampires," Kieran said gently, settling onto the couch with the fluid grace that still made Nora's pulse quicken. "You're a wellspring, and they're drawn to your abundant life force." "That's what Luna said, but it sounds like something out of a fantasy novel." Nora laughed, remembering her own disbelief just months earlier. "I thought the same thing, but the supernatural world exists alongside ours, and some humans have abilities that bridge both realities." "Like you, like us," Nora confirmed. "Would you like to understand what you're dealing with?" Luna has been documenting successful supernatural partnerships creating resources for others who find themselves in similar situations. Over the next hour, they explained the complexities of wellspring abilities, the nature of energy vampires, and the possibilities for partnership.